Hello and welcome to today's webinar, BIM for Multifamily Projects. This webinar is brought to you by LiveLab Learning, which is a subsidiary of Academic Corp, a wholly owned applied software company created to provide world-class training. I'm Casey Pruitt and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. Throughout our presentation, we encourage you to interact with us by typing in questions and comments using the questions pane. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to you online on our YouTube channel. If you haven't already, search LiveLab Learning on Facebook and like our page to receive the latest information and special offers. When you visit our website, livelablearning.com, there's a complete schedule of upcoming training. Applied Software is a full-service professional services firm serving the AEC and manufacturing industries. We are a leading BIM services provider and one of the largest Autodesk partners in the southeastern United States. We have been in business since 1982, and in that time we have helped more than 5,000 clients. In 2014, we were an Autodesk Platinum Club Award winner. To learn more about Applied Software, please visit our website, www.asti.com. Please take note of our upcoming events. On July 23rd and 24th, we'll be in Arlington, Virginia for the North American Revit Technology Conference. On July 24th and 25th, we will be in New Orleans for the AIA Mississippi. On Wednesday, July 29th, we will hold BIM and Beer Boston. On July 31st and August 1st, we will be in Boca Raton for the AIA Florida. John Ade is the director of the AE Technology Group at Applied Software. He has over 30 years of AEC experience, is an Autodesk Revit certified professional, and a registered architect in Georgia. John first used Revit version 5.0 and has been using and implementing Revit for 10 years. Applied Software is very lucky to have John as a part of our team. Please join me in welcoming today's presenter, John Ade.
Thank you, Casey, and welcome everyone. This will be hopefully an informative webinar for you all today. I've found over the past few days when I've been doing a little bit more research and past months and years working with our clients that multifamily has become a very big user of BIM and Revit as a BIM authoring tool. And it's been interesting to see the trends and how people have migrated or changed a particular method of using Revit from one particular way to another, and we'll talk about that as part of the webinar. I'm just starting off with a slide about building information modeling. Many of you have probably been to a presentation or many that has discussed what building information modeling is, and so I thought it would be a good starting point for the conversation, since this webinar is about building information modeling and Revit and its role in multifamily design. So I won't bore you or belabor you with the details of it, but just knowing that building information modeling is a process that is all-encompassing of all the design and construction and even operations of a particular facility, where we as an industry are still just starting to touch on what all the capabilities are of this information. How we put it together definitely serves us and the owner as we're designing something and getting it built, but there's so much more that is ahead of us as building information modeling and the tools mature. So most people, hopefully most of you, already are involved in implementing BIM, and if not, then hopefully this will be some good foreknowledge or a good stepping stone into the conversation about BIM for multifamily projects. Some of the basic advantages for multifamily or any project using BIM is being able to contain your project and all the information about it in a smaller data set that is predominantly 3D geometry, but also has relationships and information that you can leverage for analysis, for cost estimating, for lighting analysis, for visualizations, and so on. So much capability, and I think people who are using Revit for multifamily design are already seeing the benefits of that. And hopefully I can clear up maybe some of the misconceptions about how to use Revit for multifamily design, but also maybe teach you something if you're already using Revit for multifamily design. So some of the learning objectives for today are just understanding what the current trends are in setting up multifamily projects using Revit, the different advantages of groups versus links. They both have advantages, and we'll talk about how you could even choose to potentially use both in your project. Can nested families define units? We'll talk a little bit about that and what you can and cannot do with a family, and some of the things you might want to consider in using families for a particular part of your project, but also clear up any mysteries about whether you can use it for actually the whole unit, if you will, design. And then kind of sum up about what considerations or things you might want to think of when you do your next multifamily project, and talk a little bit about MEP design for multifamily also. The techniques that we're going to talk about do extend into other disciplines, structure, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, and definitely want to hit some of the points regarding those. I don't have a lot of graphics. I intended to open up Revit, look under the hood at some of the basic functionality just so that you can see some of the things that I'm describing, and hopefully generate some questions that we'll leave some time at the end of the webinar for us to answer. So multifamily, this is just an example, a project that I started with a company, gosh, going on 8 years ago, maybe even longer. It was a company that did a lot of multifamily design, and this was one of their first projects. And so, you know, implementing building information modeling and Revit authoring tools, if you're not already using them, is something that requires some deliberate thought and planning if you want to be successful doing it, but there's no reason why you cannot be successfully implementing it and using it on your first project, provided you understand what you have ahead of you and what some of the investment is needed in order for it to be successful. So training, usually some consulting to help the team make sure that they're successful as they're using the tools for the first time. So although this presentation is focused on multifamily, it's really about multi-unit design. And multi-unit design includes more than just residential. Certainly it means garden-style apartment homes, high-rise apartment and condominiums, but it also means hospitality for hotels and resorts where they have units that are repeated multiple times, the same unit multiple times throughout the design. Dormitories, another form of housing, somewhere in between apartments and hospitality, but effectively a similar residential type of use. Healthcare. So in healthcare, there's also an opportunity to leverage some of these techniques for patient rooms. Sometimes surgical units are defined in a very specific way that they have a repeatable plan, and so that can be considered a unit. In education, you have classrooms often that are used maybe in primary and secondary education, and even post-secondary. When you get into college and technical school level, you have classrooms and sometimes labs that have a very finite design that end up being repeated multiple times. So just want to make sure that people understand that although this is called multifamily, I almost wish we had called it multi-unit design for BIM and Revit, just because it really can reach into other types of design projects. Again, just a couple of cutaway views of a couple of different plans, one being hospitality, one being multifamily, and we'll take a little bit closer look at a couple of these plans, use them as examples for some of the things that I was going to talk about during the presentation. A big consideration in making choices about how you use Revit for multifamily or multi-unit design is going to be the project size. So you may make different choices depending on how large the project is. Many people who are still getting into BIM and may not already have a lot of experience with it or Revit may not understand that BIM does not mean everything is in one model. Now, as much as possible, we like to put as much of the project in a single model, but when it becomes a large, meandering, say, garden-style apartment project, it tends to be unfeasible to contain that in one model. Or if it is, it does require a lot of view work to break it up. So you may have a master file, I didn't diagram this, where you link all your buildings into it if you're trying to do a single set of documents, and a lot of people are starting to do that. Again, it's kind of getting back to a little bit of a CAD type of workflow in some respects, but what we're doing is linking all the different parts and pieces of the project into one file that's used for documentation and let the other models end up just being the design. So I don't want to talk too much about that, but certainly when you get into large campus style projects or large buildings that really need to be divided up, you need to think about that ahead of time. So good project planning is always recommended and is always a good thing no matter what the size of the project. Again, is it multiple buildings or a single building? Is it high-rise? Is it multi-use? So you might have different uses in the building, which is becoming very prevalent too, especially in urban environments and even in some suburban environments. And then how many different unit types do you have? Is it just a few? If you're doing garden style, you may only have 5 basic unit types. Of course, they may vary from one instance to the next, so you get variations on them. But in the basic number of unit types, you may only have a handful, but it may, again, with those variations, turn into many, many more, 10, 20, even more. So all these are things to talk about. Well, how did we do it in the past, or how are some of you still doing it? I would hazard a guess that a lot of you, if you're not already using Revit for multifamily or multi-unit design, or using AutoCAD or even MicroStation or some tool like that, and you're doing a lot of referencing or XREFerencing depending on the product. And so you'll have your units be a file unto itself, and it may get referenced into a level plan, and then obviously that makes your composite plan, but you might have base building envelope information that comes from another XREFerence. So you might have this XREFerence scheme or practice in place in your organization. The benefit of Revit is to eliminate some of that need, or at least reduce the amount of files. With unit design, you still have the units, and that's a big part of the conversation today. Lines in lieu of walls. What I mean by that is, unless you're using a more intelligent CAD package, you're probably just using line work to represent walls, doors, windows, furniture, plumbing fixtures, and so on. Those of you who are using either Bentley architecture or AutoCAD architecture, something like that, and are using some of those tools, they are BIM, if you will, style tools that will allow you to model and have a little bit more intelligence in what you're designing. But you are still working in a CAD environment. While cleanups tend to be a challenge too, when you're working with references and breaking up your model into different parts and pieces. And then, as I said, XREF management or reference management is a big part of doing it, the way many of us learned how to do it and the way many probably still are. Now, I put this in here because I was looking back through my records at stuff that we had developed about 8 or 9 years ago for another firm, and noticed that we had, copies of some of the diagrams that we had put together with our team. And again, these were for different file types or different end outputs that we're trying to assemble, and you'll see that they show lists of X references that are either attached or overlaid to make a composite sheet or a composite drawing. A lot of work went into this to make it consistent for people, but it's not always that intuitive. So somebody had to manage that. And I would hazard a guess that even in an environment using Revit with multi-unit design, you really need somebody who's very comfortable with it to kind of guide the other teams as they're learning. Now, one thing, I didn't get enough time to set up a lot for this as an example. I've leveraged massing in Revit for doing test fitting for interior design and for blocking for doing a building, and in the concept or the nature of those two particular applications, you at an early stage in your project where you may have a footprint that you're working with and want to see how the parts and pieces fit together, you can actually use massing. So this is just showing you an example of basically two masses that have been copied and defined with different information. So and some of that information you can derive from the mass too, and that's the overall square footage of it. So you can actually do early area analysis also by using massing. So I see a great opportunity. Obviously this is a smaller group of people overall, and usually one or two people in a small to medium-sized firm, but the people who are doing the feasibility studies, they get a site plan, they're trying to determine how much building, how many units they can put on a project. They can actually mass the units, group those together, and make a building full of units. You can add levels and intersect the masses and get some quick area analysis and determine what is possible on the site, and even use design options to come up with different iterations or scenarios for different parts of the site. So I may try and do a massing webinar in the future where I really expand on this further, and I do have the file that I can pull up if anybody has questions later. But I do think massing has an opportunity in early multi-unit design. So the big question is, how do you set up your project? How do you use this very powerful tool, this very powerful process, leverage it in such a way that it's going to make your work easier, make it more accurate and less frustrating, and in the end, we want to make more money. We want to do great design, but we don't want to have to spend all our fee just figuring out how to document our designs and get them out the door. So one consideration, again, going back to that slide about what type of project or what is the size of your project is it small enough where you could do everything in one model, where it doesn't need to be broken up into a lot of different parts and pieces. I would suggest that if it's a small enough project, I don't have a number in my head, but let's say it was well under 100 units total for the particular project or building, and maybe it's only half a dozen different unit types, maybe a few variations thrown in, I still think groups is a good way to go. But more and more people are working with larger and larger projects, and there's a lot more coming down the pike. And so they've come up with, if you will, more CAD-like ways of breaking up the project where units are separate files and they're being linked in. And what that does, it gives you an opportunity to make the envelope of the building a separate file, and then all the unit interior portions then can be designed external to it and then dropped into those unit shells, if you will. I've looked at it multiple ways. I've looked at a lot of blogs online, and the trend is going more towards links. But I think groups either combined with links for different parts of the design or groups in lieu of links when it's a smaller project is still a viable way of doing units. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of both. Okay. So a lot of larger projects now are being broken up into multiple files for different parts of the project, or if it's a work shared project, some of those parts are just put into different work sets or some combination of both. So what do you include in a unit? If we're talking about it as a group, you know, does it have all exterior walls in it? Does it have all your doors and windows? Demising or common walls between units, interior walls and doors, casework, countertops, plumbing fixtures, you name it. Furniture, sometimes I've seen furniture in units. Certainly in hospitality you might represent furniture, how things are going to get laid out. Electrical fixtures, and HVAC. So again, starting to think about the mechanical engineer and him starting to lay out his designs for the units, and if they're consistent, then he can group his information also to make it more efficient for his work. So at some point I'll actually get into Revit and just show you some of the how this breaks down and what it looks like. Not really big models, but enough that you can get the idea. So groups, again, as I said earlier, they work well in smaller to medium-sized projects. I have an example, again, that I've used for some of these slides. It's I forget how many units. I think it was about 120 units overall. 4-story project on top of parking, and it was manageable with groups, and it worked pretty well, and it was a first project for a team, and they were successful in using it and completing it that way. So groups are really easy to create, they're very easy to modify, and they have some characteristics that make them very appealing. However, groups sometimes, and I didn't put this as a bullet, does have, for lack of a technical term, some flakiness at times, depending on what you're doing with them in Revit. If you keep it simple and you try not to do too much with groups, and you know, be very judicious about using the exclude command, groups can serve you very well. Nice thing about groups is you can start out with them and then you can easily convert them to links, and we'll take a look at that. If it's a work shared project, and I'm assuming if it's a sizable project, there'll be at least 2 or more people working on it in your organization, it is best that the elements in a group are a member of one work set. Certainly if you have elements that you want to put into different work sets, I would keep it as much as possible to a minimum number of work sets. It's just easier to keep it straight in people's minds, especially when people are checking things in or out. And certainly with groups, as much as possible, you want to keep the stuff that's grouped together. Ability to exclude elements. Hopefully everybody knows that that's a characteristic of groups in Revit. What is nice about that is when you exclude an element from a group, it is no longer counted in the project. It is still part of the definition of the group, so you can re-include it back into the group at a later time if you need it, but it does get excluded from the project when you exclude it from the group, meaning it won't be counted, both in terms of material takeoffs or in terms of just scheduling items. Because everything's in the model, and because a group definition is yet something else that Revit or any database-driven tool would have to track, it will make the model larger. So again, larger project, lots of groups, lots of instances, all those will equate into making it a larger project, and that might make you think about links instead. So creating groups, pretty easy process. You select the elements you want to group together. On the ribbon, once you have a selection, you have a tool that allows you to group them. There is a tool that allows you to launch the Create Group tool first, but certainly most people learn to select the objects first. The ribbon then adapts to the Modify tab on the ribbon, and then you have the tool presented to you, and then it'll ask you to give that particular group a name. So pretty easy process. And you'll notice that I put the 4th bullet attached detail group. What that means is if you grab a whole bunch of model elements like I have here on the left, and you have a bunch of stuff tagged or dimensioned or noted or some extra detail information in that particular view when you selected those elements, it will consider them detail elements that go with that model, those model elements, and it will not only create a separate detail group, but it'll attach it or associate it with the model group. If I have time, I'll show that. That can be very handy. Some people leverage that, other people, they don't really care. So again, a couple of examples of different thought processes on what you would group together. So in this particular example, the unit and half the demising wall, since it was a dual stud or dual track demising wall, so one side of the demising wall and the common corridor wall, and all the interior partitions and elements were included in the group, and that included the room objects. I have tried many times in working with clients, looked at including the exterior skin, especially if it's not a heavily articulated skin and it's just problematic. It would have to be a very regimented, very predictable, and very simple skin, in my opinion, for you to even consider including that as part of your groups, your unit groups. The skin is generally may have elements that pass from one level to the next, and so trying to include just those parts into a group can get very messy and very complicated. So I don't think you'll see, I don't have any example where I've included the exterior skin as part of a group. It would be either its own file as part of a, say, a base file, or it's going to be ungrouped. It's going to be just the exterior skin of the building. This next example shows a similar instance where it's not including the corridor walls. So it's still including the one side of the demising partition, but it's not including anything that's common to the building. And then the next level, which is what most people tend to do, or I've been seeing in with those I've been working with, are they will make the demising walls, basically the shell of the unit, as part of the base building model, and then they'll make groups for just the interior elements. And I think that's fine. I think that is actually probably the best way to do it when you're working with groups, and it works in a similar fashion when you're working with links also. So basically that was just a progression of kind of where we did it with this one project, where it was half the demising wall, which can get a little sticky, the corridor wall, and all the interior elements, but no exterior wall elements. Then just dropping off the corridor wall, and then dropping off the one half of the demising walls. That can get challenging with elements that are wall hosted. So you may need elements that are combination, wall hosted, where they're being hosted by a wall that is part of the group, and elements that and duplicate versions of those where they're not wall hosted and are not dependent on a wall for hosting them. That way they won't accidentally disappear if the wall that they need is gone. Another reason why you typically leave things like doors and windows as part of the exterior skin as part of the skin file. If you put those into the group, they will always need a host. The nice thing about groups is even without a host, the definition of those elements will still remain in the group, so that if you reintroduced a host element for them, you can re-include them into the group, and then they'll find the host if it's in the right place. Not ideal, so I tend to advise people away from that, and it's also something you'll see in a lot of the blogs and postings that, be very wary of wall hosted elements to or hosted elements that are hosted to elements that are not in your group. And then the ability to replace groups with link. You can do that dynamically by just converting a group to a link, but you can also send a group that's defined in your project out to a file, and then at a later date replace it using that same tool, but now using a file that's already out there that was generated from the group definition that maybe somebody else worked on. So I didn't clearly state that in this slide, but you do have a couple of ways or workflows for doing that. Again, best not to group hosted elements without the host. Floor-to-floor changes can be challenging. I've had some friends and clients who have created some unique workflows for making the walls extend to underside of slab at one level and then vary it at another level just by ungrouping at that level, extending walls, say, to underside of the floor above, and then placing multiples of that, and it seems to work for them. But again, it can be challenging, and there can be hiccups along the way, and you may have to verify wall heights at some point to make sure they're not too high or too low from one level to another where there's a different floor-to-floor height. And I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, and I've seen not a lot, but a little about this, and that's, how do you tag your units? You've got a plan now or a design, and you want on the floor plan to be able to tag the units and show what maybe the unit type is, the unit number is, and some other information about it. Well, effectively, you don't have a unit. You cannot tag groups, so you tend to need something else. So what I've been seeing people do, and I've done my representation of that as an example, is to create some sort of family that you can tag and use for some other purpose, maybe as part of the group or part of the design. I felt I would be remiss if I didn't bring up nesting groups. I have not seen a lot on that, and anytime I teach people to nest groups, I also throw in the caveat that you need to be very careful about how you nest things and try and make the nested group something that is highly repeatable. I actually have a unit that does have a nested group, so I'll show you that. I have an image coming up that actually shows a nested group within a group. The benefit is if the sub or nested group can be used in other groups, so say it's a repeated kitchen layout or bathroom layout, something that just is being leveraged multiple times. I think of cruise ship design and how they really engineer the rooms, and they are brought to the site and slipped in, and part of that room is a bathroom unit, and often that bathroom unit is made separate from the room because the room may be longer, may be wider, but the bathroom they try and make almost identical for most of them. So again, the bathroom is repeated more often than the actual layout, but you can leverage that as a nested group. You just have to really manage that and make sure that you don't run into any problems, and if you do, then you would just, in my opinion, drop that group within your unit group. Maybe keep it as a group somewhere so you can always bring it in if you need to update it faster, but the idea is using groups to update instances is key. So like I said here on my slide, some recommend against nesting. I think it's more of a comfort level, and if you're good at controlling the work in your project, then you might consider nesting for some very specific case. Again, I've already said it once, keep it simple. Standard layouts shared by multiple units is great for groups and furniture layouts. So again, when we get into links, maybe you want to put furniture in your model, but you don't need it all the time. So maybe it's a separate linked model, but even then you might use groups for placing them. Groups are great for furniture layouts. So again, here's just a screen capture from one of my models where the unit did have a nested group for the kitchen layout. Need to keep an eye on the time. I want to make sure I get to show you a few things. So some of the pros and cons for groups. I would say the pro, the workflow, it's very easy. In-place editing is awesome. The walls are easier to make cleanup with the demising and the exterior skin walls as long as they're all in the same project. You're just making your views right there. You don't have to maybe make them for the unit plan elsewhere. Scheduling is really good except for the units themselves. So you do need something else to schedule the units, and that gets to the family. Maybe I shouldn't have put that bullet in the way I did. Less management? No, I'd say it's different management. Override, so the whole being able to exclude elements. Performance? That's going to depend on a lot of factors, like I said before. Number of units, variations of units, nested units, size of the project, so the overall number of instances of the group. As the numbers go up, that's when groups are going to start to look less and less attractive. Cons, again, performance gets worse as it gets larger, but that's pretty much typical of the nature of the beast. The more complicated, the more stuff, the larger the model, your performance may take a hit. There are some known issues with groups. Some people have inconsistent results mirroring groups. I guess I've been pretty lucky, but I'm not doing a lot of production work these days. In-place families are recommended against just in general, but certainly when you're grouping stuff, because what happens is every time you place that group, you're now creating a new in-place family. So in-place families are bad when you're copying it around. It's just bad, 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 so don't do it. Heights by level, inconsistency, user errors. I mean, that's something we all confront, and that's probably one of the bigger challenges is the tool can probably do it multiple ways, but making people do it consistently and know when to do something, when not to, is usually the challenge. And you will get some errors when you ungroup elements sometimes. It just means that you need to read the errors or warnings and address them appropriately. So the flip side of the coin is links. Links are more like XREFs or referencing. It allows for modifying units outside of the main model, which can be good for distributing work amongst the team because some people on the team may be working specifically on the unit design. Links do not allow excluding elements. It does allow you to hide elements, but that doesn't remove it from the model where it's being linked. So it's you have half the benefit, and it's not as easy because you got to tab into the element, hide that element, and hiding objects by element becomes not problematic, but it's just one more thing that unless it's documented, somebody may not know that something's missing sometimes. With links, it's possible to bind a link, and when you do that, it converts it into a group in your model. So as much as you can go from groups to links, you can also go from links to groups very easily. Links are easy to identify by giving them a unique name, which can be the unit number, the unit type, or a combination of both in visibility graphics. It does tend to keep individual files smaller because now you're linking stuff, and you can unlink when you don't need a particular unit or units, and just working on say the exterior skin of the building. Certainly if it's a work shared project, that comes into play too, allowing you to put your linked units into separate work sets. It does help control the consistency of the unit layouts a little bit better because you don't have an easier way to exclude elements. They're pretty flexible and similar to a CAD workflow. That's not a bad thing. I'm just trying to make an alignment there, and a lot of people have been saying that, but in the back of my mind, you're still using Revit for your units. You're linking them, which means you're combining them together into a composite model. That's still good. You're getting the benefits of Revit for all the work. You can still schedule it. You still get the immediate update. So even though it's more of a CAD workflow, it's still BIM. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And again, I put the question mark after this. Some of these actually came from comments people put on the web, so they're not all mine, but I wanted to be a little bit transparent with y'all. Let's see, management issues, system names, avoiding duplicates, dealing with documentation issues. That the only issue there is the same anywhere as if it's a big project, multiple files, you got to bring them together ideally if you're doing one set of issue documents. Let's see, families for units. I did want to address this. So I've got a quick example, but basically you can create some family out of some category that you don't typically use for building design, and it can be a container for information. What I decided to do was just make it the outline of the unit, and that way I can actually use that for some blocking or test fitting, if you will. And then I created some shared parameters to be able to tag it. Unfortunately, you can't create system families or place system families, nest them in a component family or a placeable family. And so that's why you can't actually use a family for a unit. It would be very clever if you could, but you can't. And so I'm not going to mislead you and say you can. You could create some geometry that looks like a wall, but it wouldn't really be a wall. It wouldn't behave like a wall, but it might fill the geometry needs. But I wouldn't recommend it just because you would be going backwards a little bit in using the tool. Not really an alternative to groups or links because you're not really grouping or linking a complete unit. You can only put certain geometry and other nested placeable components in it. So you can use it for, say, furniture layouts. That's possible. Good for preliminary layout and analysis. That's my option, and taggable. So this example is basically just showing 4 units side by side. They're all the same unit, but they each have a different unit name, and I think I gave them different unit types. No, they're all unit type A. But basically it was just dash line work, and it was a way for me to show a footprint, something that goes right underneath the unit. The unit geometry would just go on top of it, but I can tag it, and I can add any kind of parameter I want, and as long as it's a shared parameter, then I can add it to my tag, and that's what I did here. I had the unit type and the unit number, and so it made it very easy to tag. And I created its own subcategory for the line work, which means I can turn the line work off, but yet keep the object on, which keeps the tag on. So you can control the visibility of this very easily also. I like area plans also as a way of showing just the unit layout and also doing color fill plans with it. So I'll just jump to it, and basically, area plans are already in Revit. You can use the area separation to define what the limits of a unit are, and then you can, give these things a number. You can give it a name that represents the type, and it will also calculate the area for the unit, so you can very quickly get a nice way of presenting that stuff, but also labeling it. But we still need a way to usually label the units, and most people that I've seen are just using a generic annotation, not a generic tag or a tag. Going back here, what I did here is the family type for this is actually, and some of you will laugh who have done a lot of family editing, but it's a nurse call station. Not going to use that in my multifamily residential design. So, and if it was, say, assisted living or something like that, you might have that. So you just pick some other less used category for the family so that you can isolate it to filter it out or whatever. All right, we're getting close to the end of the slides, and I should have hopefully a few minutes just to open up Revit and maybe show you a couple things. But groups are still a benefit for MEP design, again, provided that the layouts are the same. If you have a unit A and then you have a unit A1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all it is minor variations, but the HVAC is identical in all of them, then why not group it? You can. Most multifamily design, the HVAC is an isolated system for that particular unit anyways, and that's what makes it good for that. When you get into something like classroom, education or healthcare, it may not work out as well, and it may not be able to leverage the benefits of groups or links. But certainly multifamily, it's there. Electrical, not so much. You can group the fixtures and equipment, but the circuiting, the panels and circuiting should not be grouped. At least that was the wisdom I was given by my MEP expert on staff, and he actually co-authored a book on Revit for MEP, so he's pretty knowledgeable of the product. He's an architect first, but he's put a lot of time and effort into working with engineers on that book. Plumbing will work too. The biggest challenge with plumbing is where you have, say, a supply line coming in or maybe a waste line coming out to a central line. Where they connect, it will want to put in some sort of connector. And I meant to put some more in this slide, and I think I forgot. Obviously, common areas, the public space, and amenities won't be grouped. They're just part of the overall design. Let's see, I've kind of gone over all this. Links are more CAD-like, but effective. And don't take CAD as bad. It's just a more CAD workflow-like, let's put it that way. It's still BIM. Groups are more BIM-like because everything's in the one model. That can be a good thing, but as the project gets bigger, maybe not so much. Families can be used for 2D or components, but not for wall geometry or system families. A family can be used to identify unit, as I showed you. Groups for small to medium projects, probably best. Links are probably going to be better for larger, more complex projects. Either one's going to require some careful planning and managing it. Some more best practices, work sets. Obviously, if it's a work shared environment, work sets can be a good way to isolate some of the geometry, whether it's some or all the units from the main building or the amenities, or even different levels. Phasing can be helpful too. I've seen phasing. I didn't want to kind of give away anybody's secret sauce, but I've seen phasing used. So if I at least just kind of throw it out there, maybe you can explore this a little bit on your own. But phasing can be an interesting way of setting up units where it's a whole unit, and phasing can be used to control when and where, say, common walls show up in a linked model, where they're going to be linked. Again, families can help with tagging, and groups and links can be used together. So again, you may link the main geometry for your unit in, and then copy it around, mirror it, whatever. Mirroring links works wonderfully. And then use groups to populate some of the detail information that may even vary from one unit to the next, but things like furniture, maybe even a kitchen or something like that. I probably should see if there's any questions. I may switch to Revit while Casey's maybe sending me a question or two, but I'm going to go ahead and at least open up Revit here.
Yeah, let's begin our question and answer session. We do have some questions here.
Okay.
The first question is, can you go over your reason for switching a group to a link?
The reason for doing it? Actually, this might be a good little segue here, but you may have some units that you've developed in the past on a project. You may export them or save them out as their own files, and then you're starting to do a new project. You could quickly bring them in as groups, start to do your tentative design. Let's see, I have another model here, and then once you've the group and the layout of the groups has settled down a little bit, then you could actually export them back out as links. And when you export something out as a link, let's see if I got the right one here. All right, this is all for creating a group, but these are all the same one. If I created this as a group and it's all the same unit, say there was 10 of them on the floor, I could pick each one of those groups, send them all out to be a link, or have a file that already exists replace them as a link. And so it's really maybe the early in design, groups may serve you better by not having to coordinate links and where demising walls are everything. You do some of that with the group in the design, and then once it gets further along, maybe into DD, you convert them over to links. So I can see groups as a way of starting a project and then converting them over to links. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Okay, and then someone just added to that, when creating a link, is a common reference point needed?
No. I'm kind of laughing because I was working with a couple of files earlier and I didn't realize that the unit was at like some elevation way up above the basic template that I was starting with, and it wasn't showing it when I brought it in when I linked it because it's going to bring it in at that elevation. So I'd say elevation is probably the biggest thing you want to be wary of when you bring in a link. As much as possible, start off with kind of a common base project elevation of, say, 0 feet 0 inches, instead of having your project be at 0 and your unit be from some other project at some other elevation. But other than that, no, because you're going to be moving and copying and mirroring them and potentially rotating them, so you're going to move them around anyways. But the level thing can take you by surprise, like it did me.
Okay, and then can you open a linked file while the main model is open?
You can, but it's going to unload that link. So that's just a Revit operation. So if I have, I can probably show you how that works, but let me see if I can open up the right file. Can't remember if this one's, oh, these are all groups. Sorry, this isn't all links. That's not going to help you. Yeah, these are all groups. But effectively, if these were all, if this unit was linked in and I go to open up that unit file that's linked in, it will unload it from this file. And then when I close out of the unit file, I'd have to reload it. And you do that through the insert manage links dialog. So you'd have an entry for every unit that was loaded in. The one that you opened up would become unloaded and you just have to reload it.
Okay. What was your reason for not including windows in groups and keeping them live in the model? Is this to reduce live wall hosting problems with the windows?
Yeah, I'm going to do it with something a little simpler because it'll just be easier to show it, and instead of working with one of these bigger layouts. So let's just assume that that's my unit plan. All right, I'm going to keep it really simple, a little bit more, come on, that's not what you're supposed to do. Wall. Okay, and just to keep it simple, I'm just going to put a window here, okay? Now, if my unit is just going to be the interior elements, whatever they may be, and I choose to take this also, so imagine that this wall just keeps extending on out here, and maybe I actually am going to take like these, and I decide to take this, and I go ahead and make a group of it. So you select your elements, you use the create group tool, and I'll just call it standard king, something like that. So I'm using hospitality as an option. So there's my group, and I can even move obviously the insertion point and maybe make it the inside corner of that room. So if I want to place this now, that window is part of my group definition. And that's one thing that's pretty clever that Revit does is if I come over here now, and I've got two ways of placing a group. So I can go to the Model tab here, Model panel here, and go to Model Group, Place Model Group, and then any model groups will be listed in your type selector. And I want to do the one I just created, which was Standard King. Now, as long as I place this with that same insertion point where that window will intersect that host wall, I've got no problem. Okay? And so you notice that this group placed and that window placed. The biggest problem, and this is correctable by the way, is if I place this group again, and say I either get a little twitchy or I just snap to the wrong thing and I place it, when I let go of that group, it's going to tell me elements were deleted. That language there is typical Autodesk Revit scare you language, but it's not absolutely true. So if I hit OK, well, great. First of all, it's in the wrong position, but notice what happens when I hover over on top of that group and select it. That window is still there. So if I now move this group into the correct position, let's see if I can find its insertion point and bring it up there. All right, it will not automatically be re-included in the group. I would have to select the group, I would have to hover over the group until I see that element reappear, and I'd have to tab over it until I can select it, and you'll get an icon or that'll allow you to restore it or re-include it back into the group. And when you do that, it will then find the host and you'll be okay. So it's not a you can't, it's just you'll run into situations like this where elements won't appear if they don't have the host. But if you reintroduce the host, then you can make them reappear.
Okay. What is your workflow for populating the building floor plan with groups while windows are live for easy coordination between the unit plans and the overall floor plans?
Windows live meaning in the group?
Mm-hmm.
If that's what you mean, I would still recommend against it. If it's something simple like this is not to talk ill of this type of work because I've done it myself, but if you're doing, say, interstate hotels where it's very rhythmic, not a lot of articulation to the facade, you might be able to put the window in it. The problem is the only way you're going to be able to keep laying out units like this is to make sure that there's a wall, or you're going to end up putting a wall there. My preference would be to create the shell and kind of define, make sure as you're laying it out, you're accommodating the unit sizes. And that's where something like this family that I had created, now granted it's not going to be what looks like that, might be a good way to lay it out so you can get an idea where the skin goes, where the units are going to go, and then come back and populate it with the interior unit plan. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think that's how I was interpreting it.
Okay. There's one last question. Can you extract quantities such as SF of drywall, flooring, etc.?
Yes, from groups and from links.
Okay, are there any other questions? Why not have the reference planes as part of the unit groups to be used for easy alignment?
Oh, I actually do. I just didn't really highlight it. So if you'll notice that I actually have, let me see if I've got that unit plan handy. So that's actually a really good question. I've seen more and more people using reference planes as part of their overall plan and also part of their unit plan, so it makes it easier to align them. So the question is, yes, that's a good idea. Or the answer is, yes, that's a good idea. I just didn't make a point of it in my presentation, and I should have.
Okay. All right, if that's all the questions, then we can go ahead and wrap this up. Anything else? Anyone else? Okay, well, thanks for joining us today. We hope you found this webinar informative and helpful to your business, and we look forward to you joining us in the future for more webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.